What's going on, YouTube? Metal Complex here, and welcome to episode 3 of the quest for the perfect budget knife. If you are new to my channel, I like to upload knife reviews, knife overviews, and unboxings during the week. On the weekends, I have, on Saturdays, this series, the quest for the perfect budget knife. And then on Sundays, I have the knife guy. I also like to do some discussion topics. I like to upload basically every single day. So if that sounds good to you, go ahead and hit subscribe. Make sure your notifications are set to all because there's definitely more content coming. Like I said, we are on episode 3. Today we're going to be talking about deployment. I want to let everybody know, this has actually been bumped up to a 10-part series from a 9-part series. I've added in episode 9, the little details. Things that I was thinking about the other night. I was like, I should probably offer some clarification on a few things that a lot of makers seem to just not get right. So this has been moved from a 9-part series to a 10-part series with the final episode being Price. If you've missed some of the other episodes, I would suggest you go back and watch them so that you have clarification on how I arrived to this point. The most recent 2 episodes, the first one being overall size and blade length and handle materials, hardware, and pivot. Each episode has points that transition into the next episode, so it kind of helps people get an understanding of how I arrived to this point. As usual, this is just my idea, the things that I look for and, the design features that I look for. I am building this series from a functional standpoint. It's different than my quest for the perfect folding knife, where I take into consideration things like fidget factor, aesthetics, and shiny features, things like that. I'm thinking about somebody that's actually going to buy this knife and take it out and use it, right? So there are certain things that are pushed aside. If you remember last week's episode, we talked about I had decided that I would prefer phosphor bronze washers inside the pivot and not bearings, because if you're going to take this thing out and use it, it's going to be more convenient to have a washer setup than a bearing setup. Even though bearings do okay in dirty environments, washers are simply going to be better for hard work all the way around, and that's kind of what we're building on. Also, keep in mind that I'm building this series kind of off the idea of the Rat being a very, very successful budget utility cutting tool. And I have a lot of experience with this knife. As you can see here, mine has been resharpened and it's definitely been used. And I really, really like this knife, but I think it could be quite a bit better. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I want to point out that a lot of the knives that are provided for examples in this series, starting in this episode, were provided by Jared and Kara Neves from Neves Knives. I would recommend that you pause this video, jump over to Neves Knives channel, and subscribe to them and support them, because they're definitely important figures in the knife community, and they're super generous, like super nice people. Just they lent me like 25 budget knives to use as examples in this series, so I am infinitely appreciative of that. Thank you so much. Anyways, let's go ahead and move on with this series here, or with this episode. So we're going to talk about deployment today. I have laid out a whole bunch of different deployment mechanisms. Some of them are the same, some are different, or combinations of different things. They're all common deployment mechanisms. If I were to talk about every single potential deployment mechanism, this video would be way too long. And there's a bunch of mechanisms that are just obscure and weird and are not convenient, and some of them are exclusive to more expensive knives. A lot of you might be wondering, hey, you don't have an automatic knife out there. I'm going to rule those out right away, and I'll tell you why. It's really convenient to deploy an automatic knife and then use it, but I'm thinking about me up on a ladder having another hand busy while I'm outside working with this knife, and it's a lot. I mean, I can close this with one hand, but you do have to dedicate a lot of extra brain capacity to making sure that you don't actually release that and it flies out of your hand. Automatic knives are just not going to be the best for a budget knife, and it also adds unnecessary expense to the build. I'm trying to get all the features that I want into this knife. A knife that hypothetically could be built and would hit that budget for the vast majority of people. I am trying to build something in my mind that would be good for me and that would be beneficial for the vast majority of people looking for a budget knife. It's not going to make every single person happy. Everybody defines budget differently. I define it as anything under $100 for the sake of making this series make sense and keeping my options open, but we're gonna bring it down, and we're gonna talk about price in the final episode. Okay, 4.5 minutes in, what do we have here? We have the Gonzo FH11 flipper. It's on bearings. We've already talked about bearings probably not being ideal, but a flipper is an excellent deployment mechanism, a manual one, very easy to deploy on the fly, very easy to disengage and put away. We have the CHRB Crag I just unboxed this earlier this week. It's kind of the same idea. Again, great. We've got the, what is this? I have my notes here, the Boker Saluko. By the way, all of these knives, any of them that have Amazon affiliate links that I can use, they're down in the description if you decide you just want to buy one. If you use my Amazon affiliate links, it helps support the channel. If they're not, I'll still link a website where you can find them and get them for yourselves anyway. I really like the deployment, the studs on this guy. This is a thumb stud only, much like the Rat 1. They're big and they're beefy, and it's easy to get my fingers under there. And if I were wearing gloves, given the access to this thumb stud, I probably wouldn't have a whole bunch of room here, but I would appreciate the size of that thumb stud if I were wearing gloves. You know, the Rat 1, I've got plenty of room to get underneath. I find it a little bit harder when I'm wearing gloves. I find it, a lot of times I find a situation where I just want to open it up. But here's a point I want to make. The Rat 1 is on phosphor bronze, right? This knife can be opened and it can be closed with one hand. I shook it a little bit hard there, but this knife can easily be opened and closed with one hand. Whether you want to shake it shut, whether you want to push it shut, it's easy, right? That's what we're getting at. Fidget factor when I'm building this knife is actually not something I'm concerned with. I don't need a drop shut action on a budget knife. Is it cool when you can get it? Oh yeah, look at this. This FH11 is something like $28, this all steel one. That's awesome. That's really cool. Is it absolutely necessary in, you know, my ideal budget cutting tool? No. And actually, there's the setup with the phosphor bronze. I will take the benefits of phosphor bronze and sacrifice that fall shut action, which truthfully, in terms of utility, is meaningless, to get exactly what I want. This thing does not care about dirt and debris, and I do not care about it not being a fall shut knife. It's very easy to open and close. I like the thumb stud action on it. It's great, no problem there. Same kind of thing with the Gonzo, what is this, the FH750? Yeah, the Gonzo Firebird FH750. Same kind of thing. It's running on phosphor bronze. It's plenty easy to engage and disengage. It has a different lock type. I really like the thumb studs on this guy, and this is one that really stood out to me from the group that Neves Knives sent me. This is the Statgear 8 Asus, I believe. This has a nice size of thumb stud. It's kind of in between this and this size. I've got a lot of room to get underneath it, and I think I could access that pretty easily with gloves. It probably would need a little bit more of a cutout, but this is a good size. There's another reason that I would like a larger size thumb stud, and we'll get to that. What about a combination flipper and thumb stud, right? That might be kind of useful. That makes it convenient for people who want the flipper tab and who want the thumb stud. So that's another version. This is a version that a version of deployment a lot of people really, really like, the thumb hole. Spyderco has the hole. A lot of other companies do some sort of slot like this. Very, very convenient to open. It doesn't really matter how you want to open it. If you're wearing gloves or not, it opens easily. They're flickable, they're reverse flickable. That's great. It has the fidget factor and the utility, right? So that's a pretty good means of deployment. What about a combination of that hole with a flipper tab? Then you'd have two things. You know, obviously the downside to a thumb stud is things can potentially get in the cutting path, right? So with this setup, you have fidget factor, and you've got different means of deployment. You know, you have convenience, and there's nothing that really can get caught in the cutting path. You know, it can get gunked up a little bit, right? All pretty sound means of deployment. Now, this is something that's going to have to be discussed in Loctite a little bit, or works in coordination with Loctite. I mean, not really, but I'm going to talk about why I might not want certain things, okay? Why I might not want just the flipper tab. It's fine. You know, you definitely don't have anything in the cutting path. I mean, there's literally nothing in the cutting path. The flipper tab works great. Everybody's used to them. Everybody knows how they work. Given that we'd be working with phosphor bronze, the detent setup would have to be pretty specific to making sure that it would deploy every single time and reliably. It's not that hard to get around, right? Really, the main reason I think a flipper tab is out for me is because what I've chosen, what I think is the ideal deployment mechanism, actually has a second function, and a flipper tab is not going to be able to achieve that same thing. On top of that, if you're going to be using this thing in like every conceivable situation, from office carry to like outdoor, you know, reasonable hard use, maybe on a construction site, camping, whatever, it's likely that your folding knife is not going to be the only thing in your pocket. And that flipper tab, no matter what design, it's just it's just sticking out a little bit. It's the conclusion I came to with the Hinder XM18. I like the flipper tab. I just like the knife better without it. It just doesn't take up as much room, and it's still really easy to deploy. So an all flipper is probably going to be out. Same way with the CJRB Krag. This is a super cool knife. I can't wait to talk about it. Definitely. But see what I mean? Especially in a design like this, that's a lot of extra room. It's going to snag on and knock, poke around on things in your pocket. It just would be better to just not have it. That's just my opinion. If you like flipper tabs and on your ideal budget knife, you would have one, you're not wrong for thinking that way. Again, this is just my opinion. We've kind of already established that I like the idea of a thumb stud, and I'm going to leave these out here for a second. For the same reason, a flipper tab and thumb stud combination is a neat idea, in terms of just multiple means of deployment. But again, I really just don't want that flipper tab on there. So, what about the thumb hole opening thing? So that is this has been my primary EDC for a long time, and I love this thing. I truthfully love it. I mean, the hole really doesn't get gunked up or anything. It's very easy to open and close with my thumbs. It's easy to flick. It's easy to do little fidgety things with it. So you get that benefit of fidget factor without sacrificing any meaningful utility. And the biggest benefit that this has over something that uses a thumb stud is that there's absolutely nothing in the cutting path. Let's use this one. This is a better example. This definitely has something in the cutting path, right? Both deployment mechanisms are roughly in the same place as far as where the blade starts, but on this knife, you can cut right up against, utilizing that choil and cutting right up against that blade, you don't have to worry about what's in the cutting path. On this guy, if I start cutting right here on a box, that thumb stud's going to get in the way. Positioning the thumb stud somewhere else is going to help fix that. But it's just on that knife, it's not helpful. The problem is again, this, like I said, my ideal idea of the deployment mechanism has a second function, and the thumb hole for me is, while really, really good, I think it takes a very close second place to my ideal mechanism. None of these knives actually have, I'm going to move that one out of the way because it's not going to do it either. None of these actually have the ideal setup, but truthfully, I think a thumb stud roughly about this size is going to do it, because if you make enough room for it to get your thumb underneath it, you're going to be able to deploy it easily with your fingers, whether you're wearing gloves or not, and definitely with gloves, as long as there's enough room. Make sure that we have a good amount of traction point on there. But with it being a larger size, it's going to be easier to engage with, and if you put it in exactly the right place, they double as an external stop pin. Why is that important? It's not really that important in terms of lockup, but what it is important for, considering we're going to be using a knife, you're going to be using this budget. It's going to be a budget knife, so you're probably going to use it a little bit harder than you would some of your other knives, or at least a lot of us, right? I want something that's going to be built well, that's going to handle some of those situations that you wouldn't normally use a knife for, but it's nice that it's got that. An external stop pin, using the Hinder XM18 as an example. There's a lot of other knives that utilize this feature, but since you have contact points both left and right of the blade, it mitigates pressure away from the pivot. So not only is it a little bit more durable in terms of lateral force, I'm not saying you can do the same thing with your folding knife at that point as you could a fixed blade, but it definitely has a stronger setup in terms of the damage it could potentially cause to the pivot. A lot of that pressure is mitigated towards the frame, which helps out. It also adds a layer of additional potential for stability. The problem with a lot of budget knives is when you get them, they come reasonably centered and they've got pretty solid lockup. After a while, you start to notice that the blade just starts to wiggle a little bit, and then you tighten it down and you try and get it centered back, and it just kind of, it's not super wiggly, but if you really try and force it, you can feel it a little bit, right? That's because it's just, what's stabilizing the blade is just the two liners, in the case of the rats, the two liners, the scales, and then the pivot. And then it's resting up against that stop pin back there, and then the blade is sandwiched vertically between the liner and the stop pin. In the situation with the Hinder XM18, it's sandwiched between the lock bar and the stop pin, and these external points are actually on this design. No, it's not actually meeting that stop pin. It only meets that stop pin in the closed position. But it's meeting these stop pins here. This is a wider area, more surface contact, and has additional stability left and right. That's very beneficial. And in the case of the Hinder XM18, because of where the start of the blade is positioned, the fact that there is a forward choil, which believe me we'll talk about, actually makes it so that the thumb stud is not in the cutting path. You could say the same thing about the Rat. You see here where they started the blade? This flat grind, the fact that the flat right here, this technically would be the flat of the blade, persists all the way down to where it meets the cutting edge, and then the actual blade from the spine drops right here to a cutting edge, and it creates this line. I found that when I'm cutting cardboard with this thing, that line kind of acts like a guide when I'm pushing the blade into the material. And whether that's me subconsciously guiding it that way or it's actually physically acting as a guide, I don't know. But I'm conscious of the position of the thumb stud and where the blade starts. This extra room right here that they couldn't keep sharpened because the thumb stud is right here, right? They would have designed this differently, does act as a nice choke up area. It's not quite a choil, but my point is that you can have the thumb stud there as a good, solid means of deployment, a good, trustworthy means of deployment that can be beneficial with or without gloves. It can be out of the cutting path, and at the same time, you can open yourself up for different ergonomic designs that benefit both large and small knives, which remember, we talked about in episode 1, overall size and blade length. I actually believe that there are two ideal sizes. The first one being somewhere between 8 and 8 1/4 inches overall with a 3 1/4 to 3 1/2 inch blade. And then the second one being a smaller knife to meet different types of requirements for different people. People wanting to carry it more general office carry EDC, or they're just in an area where it's not legal to carry a blade over 3 inches. The ideal size with that one would be somewhere between 6.75 and 7 1/4 inches overall. So we still have to make sure that the deployment method is going to be beneficial for those people. Oftentimes you make a knife smaller, it changes things where your hand positions are. I believe that putting a thumb stud right here, leaving additional space open right here, solves the problem with the thing being in front of the cutting path and opens up a potential for a choil that is going to be exceptionally beneficial ergonomically for a much smaller knife, all the way down to about 6 3/4 inches to 7 1/4 inches overall. The Para 3 being a great example, 7 1/4 inches overall. A lot of people say, oh, well, the cutting edge, to overall length is just weird. Let me tell you, being somebody who's carried this, I don't care that this thing, only has a 3-inch cutting edge or whatever it is, 2.7, 2.8 inches. It's just slightly under, isn't it? What's the actual cutting edge on that guy? Let's measure it. A lot of people get so bent out of shape about not having additional cutting edge on their knife like this. It's 7 1/4 inches overall. It's got just barely right at 3 inches, I think. And then the actual cutting edge is only like it's like 2.75. I don't care. I don't care if I was outside on a job site or at my office. That is plenty of cutting edge for me. I appreciate having that little area right there. We're going to talk about that more in ergonomics, but it's all going to coincide. So just to be clear, I know a lot of you are like, God dang, people are generally split. They either like thumb stud, they like thumb hole, or they like flippers. Everything else is kind of in obscurity. Those are the 3 main deployment types. Some people like some combination of 2 of them. I even mentioned the idea of having all 3 on my Ultimate folding knife, but that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's kind of a pipe dream. It's kind of like you have to pick one. I think somebody even told me that. My choice would be thumb stud. And now, while the general person might not need the excess stability of a design that utilizes thumb studs as stops or external stops, I think it could be designed in a way that would be out of the way and wouldn't cause any disadvantage for somebody who didn't need the excess strength, but would definitely create an advantageous situation for somebody who could utilize that excess stability and strength. And you in theory, would never have an issue with the blade having excess play or wiggle as long as you weren't doing anything crazy with your knife. Guys, that's going to be pretty much it for episode 3 on deployment. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you got something from it. As usual, just, you don't have to think exactly like me. Just apply this way of thinking to whatever you believe would be ideal. If you enjoyed this episode or found it entertaining or informative in any way, shape, or form, please leave a like. If you'd like to check out my other content, I do, of course, have lots of videos of knives that are either expensive or inexpensive that I do or don't like, so check those out. And if you enjoy all my content, click on that Metal Complex logo right here and subscribe to my channel because there's definitely more coming. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and have a great day.